Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. Sunday was the day that if you wanted to enter the NBA draft, even just to test the NBA draft waters, just to put your name in there and see what the response was, you had to have your name in by Sunday at midnight. It's why we've talked about all these stay or go decisions in the last week to 10 days on the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. We talked about Armando Bacot's decision to return to North Carolina a few weeks ago. We talked about Oscar Tshiebwe's decision to return to Kentucky last week. We talked about Jaime Jaquez at UCLA returning to UCLA. We talked about some of the other guys too. Kofi Coburn deciding to go pro at Illinois. Johnny Juzang deciding to go pro at UCLA. And, of course, Shaedon Sharpe, we talked about on last episode, the kid that went to Kentucky, never really played, and is now testing the NBA draft waters. So Sunday was the deadline. It was a very important date. But I would argue that coming into Sunday, most of the big decisions had been made. Most of the big decisions had been made, and we were really waiting on only one or two, and there wasn't a single bigger decision that had been yet to be made coming into Sunday than that of Caleb Love, the breakout star of the NCAA tournament, just balled out all tournament long for North Carolina. He was really the biggest guy in college basketball that had yet to make a decision, and he is really the glue that was really going to make North Carolina just a real problem going into 2022-2023, coming off their national championship game appearance. 3 starters were projected back, but if Caleb Love announced he was coming back, that puts North Carolina into a different stratosphere where some people would have them ranked number 1 in the country going into 2022-2023. Well, it took till about 5:15 Eastern time. But about 5:15 Eastern time on Sunday, again, remember the draft deadline was Sunday at midnight to even declare for the draft. Now, you could still pull out, but to go through the process, you had to declare by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Eastern time. Well, Caleb Love made his decision about 5:15 Eastern. And at 5:15 Eastern, drum roll please, Caleb Love decided that he is coming back to the University of North Carolina. And I don't want to say it's the single biggest decision that has been made over the last 2 or 3 weeks, because that was probably Oscar Tshiebwe. But again, when you take the talent of the player with the team that is surrounding him, I think you can argue that Caleb Love's decision impacts college basketball as much as any other decision in college basketball this offseason. And I'll also say this. We now have a new conversation about who is the number 1 team in the country, as North Carolina is now returning 4 starters. First of all, in terms of Caleb Love, look, this is one of these guys. I think he's actually gotten a little bit of a bad and unfair reputation in basketball circles, right? I get it. He came to North Carolina, McDonald's All-American. He's the latest guy to wear the baby blue Carolina Tar Heels gear, and we all think he's going to be a one-and-done last year. And to be blunt, he wasn't very good as a freshman. When I say last year, I mean the 2020-2021 season, so 2 years ago. He comes to Carolina. He doesn't have the season that anyone is expecting, to the point, by the way, Roy Williams, the previous coach of North Carolina, dropped an incredible line on him during his freshman year. Talking about Caleb Love and R.J. Davis, the 2 guards that were freshmen during Roy Williams last year. Roy Williams says, those guys are going to be really good basketball players. They've just got to decide to do it before I die. That was how Roy Williams described Caleb Love. And so I do think Caleb Love has gotten a little bit of an unfair reputation because everybody thought he was a one and done. Everybody saw him struggle during his freshman year. But I don't think people realize how good this guy was this past season. Freshman year, again, struggled very much. On the season, averaged 10.5 points, averaged 3.5 assists, and shot just 26% from 3. Not a very good freshman, so he comes back this year. North Carolina isn't very good early, and so you're not really paying attention to Caleb Love. Well, what I can tell you is that across the board, Caleb Love was a significantly better player than he was a season ago. This year, he averaged 16 points per game, up from 10.5. Same assists, shot 36% from three-point land, and his turnovers were down from 3 to 2.5 a game. So he was a significantly better player for a team that got better down the stretch, and this was the guy. Listen, Armando Bacot was awesome all year, but this was the guy that, to me, when he figured it out, When he started playing to his potential, that was when North Carolina went from, oh, they might not make the tournament to, oh, that team can win the national championship. And that is who Caleb Love was over the final probably 5-6 weeks of the season. He was one of the best players in college basketball. Like I said a minute ago, he was one of the breakout stars of the NCAA tournament. But I would argue that, to be blunt, it really started before the NCAA tournament. That big win at Duke, Caleb Love wasn't great. But he had 22 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists to help the Tar Heels upset Duke at Cameron on Coach K's final game. And then, like I said, one of the absolute breakout stars of the NCAA tournament. 23 points in the opener against Marquette. Statistically wasn't great against Baylor in that second round game that went to overtime. That was one of the craziest games of the tournament. But what I can tell you is if you watch that game, you know darn well that when Caleb Love fouled out, that was when Carolina completely fell apart. Brady Manick obviously had been ejected by that point, but they were okay until Caleb Love fouled out, and then they couldn't do anything right. Then you get to the Sweet 16 against UCLA, 30 points against UCLA, including, I would argue, the 2 biggest shots of that game. North Carolina with under 2 minutes to go is down by 3. He hits a big 3 to tie it up at 64, and then he hits the big 3 to take the lead 67-64 in a game that North Carolina ultimately won. North Carolina down 3 before he hits the first 3. When he makes the second 3, North Carolina never gives up the lead, and North Carolina advances to the Elite Eight where they beat St. Peter's. Finally, that second Duke game, when you knew what you were going to get from him, the third matchup with Duke overall, who was the best player on the floor that night? We all know who it was, and we all know that Caleb Love made the play that essentially sealed that game. After those Mark Williams missed foul shots, 26 seconds left, Carolina's up 1. Can Duke get the stop? Caleb Williams bangs the 3 from 30 feet away. And so I see all this stuff about Caleb. Well, how good is he? And this guy was awesome in the NCAA tournament, and I believe that he is what is going to take North Carolina to the next level. I'll take it a step further. He's one of those guys, like if you just look at NBA mock draft boards, wasn't rated that high, if high at all. I think a lot of that was based on who he was early in the season and in the middle of the season. I truly believe if he had gone through the draft process, he would have not only been drafted, I think he would have found his way into the back end of the first round. Instead, he decides to return to North Carolina. And with it, let me say this. I now have North Carolina as my number 1 team in college basketball coming into next year. That is right. Caleb Love's decision elevates North Carolina to my preseason number 1 team in college basketball. First of all, this is what you need to know in terms of who they're returning. They are now returning 4 of their top 5 scorers, and it was really 6 of their top 8 scorers, and 4 starters off that team that made the national championship game. They're returning Armando Bacot, who I talked about last week, 16 points, 13 rebounds, ACC Player of the Year runner-up to Alondas Williams. This was a guy that, never forget, had 5 straight games, with 15-plus rebounds in the NCAA tournament. Armando Bacot, I'm talking about now, 15-16 versus Baylor, 14-15 versus UCLA, 20-22 versus St. Peter's, 11-21 versus Duke, 15-15 versus Kansas, basically playing on one leg. So he's back down low. On top of that, RJ Davis announced on Saturday that he would be coming back. 13.5 points per game, 13.5 points per game, 3.5 assists per game, 37% shooting from 3 like Caleb Love. Leaky Black, big key defensive player on the wing, announces that he's going to use his extra year of eligibility. You got a couple of role players on the bench, but again, Caleb Love was the guy. Without him, it's kind of like, Oscar Tshiebwe at Kentucky. And I'm not comparing Oscar Tshiebwe, who had historically great numbers at Kentucky, to Caleb Love. But there's no Caleb Love alternative that you can get out of the portal if you're North Carolina that can drop 30 points on any given night. Just like there's nobody that can get you 20-20 if you're Kentucky if Oscar Tshiebwe decides to go pro. Instead, Caleb Love comes back, and I believe that he is absolutely the missing piece to what I now believe is the number 1 team in college basketball. Now, of course, when I say that, there's a lot of controversy. And by the way, I'm going to give you my updated top 25 here in a minute. But it's funny because you know what I got when I said, they're my new number 1. 4 starters back off a team that made the national championship game. You know what I heard? Torres, they really weren't that good. This is so typical. You guys overrating them. They were an 8 seed, blah, 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 blah. Well, here's the bottom line. First of all, what I would say is this. Listen, nobody knows better than me how much better North Carolina got over the course of the season because I was the guy that was crushing them all season long. I was the guy that said multiple times, I don't know if they should have hired Hubert Davis. I was dead wrong about it, but that's what I was saying in December and January when they were getting blown out by everybody. But I got to call a spade a spade. I got to be completely fair. And what I would say about Carolina is this. Yes, they were only an 8 seed, but if you look at forget the totality of their season, if you just look at the final third of their season, they were probably one of the 10 best teams in college basketball. I think I shared these stats when Armando Bacot came back, but here's the bottom line. They lose to Duke in the first Duke game early in the season, February 5th. In that game, they fell to 16-7 overall, 8-4 in the ACC. From that point forward, 16-7, 8-4, and we're thinking they might not even make the NCAA tournament at that point. From that point forward, from February 5th until April 5th, when the national championship game was played the night before, here is what North Carolina did. Again, they were 16-7 after that Duke game. They finished 29-10 overall, which I'm not great at math, but that tells me they went 13-3 down the stretch in the final 2 months of the season. Here is who they beat in the final 2 months of the season. They beat Duke at Cameron to end Coach K's regular season career. That was the one. Remember him yelling and screaming, quiet, 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 quiet. I got something to say. You have that win. You have Duke. You have Baylor, the reigning national champion in the NCAA tournament. You have UCLA, who we're going to get into in a minute in the Sweet 16, a really good UCLA team in the Sweet 16. And then you beat Duke in the Final Four. So don't tell me that, well, how can you have them number one? They were an 8 seed. Yeah, they were an 8 seed based on the totality of their season when they were getting their brains beat in by Purdue and Tennessee in November and Kentucky in December and Wake Forest in January. But by the end of the year, they were probably one of the 8 to 10 best teams in college basketball over the final 2 months of the season. The other thing I heard, this is typical of you guys. You got them overrated. This reminds me of UCLA last year. You said UCLA made a run, and they're your number one team in the country. And, I get that. I do. North Carolina is far from perfect. Keep that in mind. They still have to replace Brady Menick, who's really good. But I love this notion that comparing them to what I said about UCLA last year is an insult. Because if you remember last year, UCLA, kind of the same deal. They were an 11 seed. They started in a play-in game. They go all the way to the Final Four. And when they return their whole team the following year, I say they're the number one team in the country. Well, you had UCLA number one. You did the same thing last year. Well, first of all, they were playing much better than UCLA down the stretch. UCLA lost in the opening round of the Pac-12 tournament. They were not great late. They got hot in the NCAA tournament. But here's the funny part about that. You're telling me that it's an insult to compare them to UCLA. That's what you're saying, right? You're saying, last year you said UCLA was number one. Look what happened. And now you're doing the same with Carolina. UCLA was awesome this year. Like people were saying, comparing them to UCLA is a bad thing. UCLA was awesome this year. For people who didn't follow, UCLA was basically a top 10 team all season. They dealt with injuries all year. Cody Riley, their starting center, was out early. Johnny Juzang missed time. Tiger Campbell, their point guard, missed time. Still basically stayed in the top 10 all year. They had a month-long COVID pause. They beat Villanova. They beat Arizona. They beat USC 2 out of 3 times. And they made it to the Sweet 16 where they played North Carolina, ironically enough. And if Caleb Love missed one of those 2 threes, if they get one defensive stop, they're playing St. Peter's to go to back-to-back Final Fours. So I love the notion that people are saying, you overrated UCLA last year, now you're overrating UNC this year. Was UCLA overrated? They weren't number one. But who was number one all year? We said all year there was no definitive best team, even if Gonzaga was there. We said all year there was no definitive best team. But UCLA was in the top 10 all year despite injuries, despite COVID, and they beat Villanova, they beat Arizona. They go to the Sweet 16 where they're playing North Carolina, one defensive stop from potentially going to the Elite Eight where they would have played St. Peter's to go back-to-back Final Fours. So don't tell me that it's an insult to compare them to UCLA. But with that said, I'm not going to keep going because I do have North Carolina at number one. We're going to get to my updated top 25. And all I'll say is this. Caleb Love's return is great for college basketball, and it does reiterate one final point that I've said a lot over the last couple weeks, and so I don't want to reiterate it. This is a case of NIL being good for college basketball. I don't have all the details on all of the money that these guys are going to be making. If you saw this weekend, by the way, there was kind of a crazy story at Miami where one of their transfers, $400,000 to play at Miami. His name's Nigel Pack. I'm not making it up. Somebody tweeted it out. But I bring it up because this is another example of where NIL is helping college basketball. I believe it's the reason why Oscar Tshiebwe's back. I believe it's the reason that Armando Bacot seemingly never seriously considered going pro. And Caleb Love is the perfect example that I believe he could have potentially been a first-round pick, but definitely would have been a second-round pick. But you look at the impact that NIL had in this decision, you can't say it's nothing, right? And this is the positive impact of NIL. Remember, Caleb Love is one of those guys that, first of all, this was a guy that, first of all, he had success with NIL even this past season. He had some big deal with, I forget if it was Buffalo Wild Wings or Hooters or something like that, but Caleb Love had, this big NIL deal that even last season allowed him to make real money in college basketball. Well, now coming back as the starting point guard at North Carolina, third-year starter for one of the biggest brands in college college basketball in a state that loves their Tar Heels, I can't even imagine how much he's going to make. And I don't know what it is, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a lot of money, and it's potentially going to be even more money than he would have made going pro and deciding to be drafted in the second round or going undrafted or whatever. So we talked about NIL with Oscar Tshiebwe. We talked about NIL with Armando Bacot. I don't want to belabor the point, but at the end of the day, Caleb Love is coming back. North Carolina is my new number one in college basketball, and I am so fired up to have Caleb Love back in college basketball.